In the damp, soot-stained labyrinth of Victorian London's East End, there existed a form of beauty that was as lethal as it was mesmerizing, a beauty that glowed in the darkest hours of the night. If you were to walk through those narrow, shadow-drenched alleys in the year 1880, you might have encountered a sight that defied rational explanation. You would see groups of young matchstick girls whose ragged clothing, unwashed hair, and even the very breath they exhaled into the freezing midnight air flickered with an eerie, unstable, spectral blue luminescence. To the superstitious, they were ghost girls. To the scientists, they were walking chemical reactions. This haunting radiance, whispered about in local pubs as the ghost light, was not the product of a supernatural curse, but rather the visible signature of a relentless, systemic chemical execution. These children and young women were the dippers of the great match factories, the invisible engines of a global industry that provided the British Empire with its most essential domestic tool, the cheap, reliable friction match. In the eyes of the industrial titans, white phosphorus was a scientific miracle, a volatile, brilliant element discovered by alchemists that allowed fire to be harnessed with a simple flick of the wrist. It was affordable, it was efficient, and most importantly, it was incredibly profitable. However, within the fragile biological architecture of the workers, white phosphorus transformed into something far more predatory. It became the hungry bone disease. This toxin was not a swift executioner, it was a patient saboteur. It did not strike the heart or the lungs first. Instead, it sought out the very foundation of the human face, the jawbone. Entering through the microscopic gateways of decayed teeth or inflamed gums, the phosphorus vapors initiated a necrotic feast, dissolving the living bone tissue cell by cell while the victim was still breathing. This was the dark alchemy of the industrial age, converting human marrow into commercial convenience. Today, we are striking this poisoned match once again, not to bring light to a parlor, but to illuminate a forgotten tragedy draped in ghostly blue. We are peeling back the opulent, velvet curtains of the Victorian era to expose the structural rot that lay beneath the surface of its greatest achievements. Welcome to the hidden cost. In this investigation, we are descending into the toxic fog of the 19th century match factories to uncover the story of the girls who glowed in the dark, a story of chemical greed, skeletal decay, and a rebellion born from the ruins of a dissolving face. Prepare yourself, for the glow you are about to witness is not a beacon of hope, but the smoldering remains of a human sacrifice. To truly grasp the horror of this era, we must investigate why this glowing substance became the preferred poison of the Victorian industrial machine. The answer, as is so often the case in human history, was profit. In the mid-19th century, white phosphorus was hailed as a chemical Prometheus. It was incredibly volatile, allowing for the mass production of friction matches that could be lit with a single flick, a revolutionary convenience for every household. More importantly for the factory magnates, white phosphorus was significantly cheaper than its stable, non-toxic counterpart, red phosphorus. For the owners of Bryant and May and other titans of the industry, this price discrepancy was the margin of their fortunes. But for the matchstick girls, it was the price of their lives. The air inside these factories was a concentrated, lethal soup. Day after day, these young women worked in unventilated rooms, their faces hovering over steaming vats of phosphorus paste. As the chemicals evaporated, microscopic phosphorus particles saturated the air, filling their lungs and coating their skin in a toxic residue. But the toxin was looking for a very specific gateway into the human body, the mouth. In an age where dental hygiene was a luxury for the rich, many of these girls suffered from decayed teeth or receding gums. These open wounds acted as a biological backdoor, allowing the phosphorus vapors to bypass the body's primary defenses and migrate directly into the porous marrow of the mandible or jawbone. Once the phosphorus established its foothold within the bone tissue, a morbid form of biological alchemy was initiated. It didn't just kill cells, it hijacked the skeletal metabolism. It interfered with the delicate balance between the cells that build bone and those that recycle it, causing the solid calcium structure to transform into a brittle, honeycomb-like waste known as a sequestrum. This was the true source of the ghost light. Their faces glowed at night because their very skeletons were undergoing a slow, flameless chemical oxidation. It was a form of spontaneous combustion occurring within the living frame, a cold fire that refused to be extinguished. Every breath they took in the factory floor was another coal added to this internal furnace. The girls were not just making matches, they were being incorporated into the chemical reaction itself. As the bone began to die while still encased in flesh, the first symptoms of Phossy Jaw emerged. A dull ache that signaled the foundation of their identity was literally being consumed from the inside out. This was the dark reality of the Victorian light, a civilization fueled by a fire that ate the bones of its most vulnerable workers. As the faint, spectral blue glow began to emanate from the matchstick girl's breath, a countdown to a biological collapse had already begun. What started as a seemingly localized inflammation of the gums soon escalated into a catastrophic systemic failure that medical journals of the 19th century would record with a mixture of clinical fascination and sheer horror. This was the peak of Phossy Jaw. As the white phosphorus relentlessly consumed the blood supply to the lower face, the mandible would swell into a grotesque, distorted mass, a ripened fruit of industrial poison. But the most terrifying aspect was not the physical pain. It was the active process of decomposition while the victim was still conscious. The necrotic bone beneath the skin would literally fracture and disintegrate, seeping a thick, greenish-yellow pus that carried an overpowering, volatile stench of rotting garlic. This odor was so pervasive and stomach-churning that it rendered the victims social outcasts. Parents were often forced to isolate their own daughters in separate shacks or dark cellars, unable to endure the scent of their child's face dissolving in real time. In the dead of night, in the windowless infirmaries of East London, these exposed fragments of dying bone would emit a cold, steady blue luminescence. This was the ghost light reaching its final, triumphant stage, the chemical ghost of the factory floor now possessing the human frame. The medical establishment of the Victorian era, caught between pre-scientific tradition and the dawn of modern surgery, offered no cure, only a form of legalized butchery. To prevent the rot from spreading to the brain and causing a localized form of madness, surgeons performed radical mandibular resections. Imagine the scene. In an age before reliable anesthesia or antiseptic protocols, a young girl would be strapped to a wooden chair. The surgeon, wielding heavy steel saws and jagged forceps, would cut through the facial tissue to forcefully rip the blackened, honeycomb-textured jawbone from her skull. Many girls perished on the operating table from sheer shock or massive hemorrhaging. Those who survived were left as hollowed-out shadows of their former selves. Their lower faces collapsed inward, their tongues hung unsupported, and they were stripped of the ability to speak, smile, or consume solid food. They became the living skeletons of the Industrial Revolution, wandering monuments to a society that prioritized the cost of a matchbox over the structural integrity of a human life. This was the visceral reality of the hungry bones, a state where the body was no longer a vessel for life, but a laboratory for chemical decay. These girls lay in the darkness of the London hospital, breathing the scent of their own corruption, watching their identities dissolve in the flickering blue light. They were the human sacrifices at the altar of the free market, their facial features traded for a few extra pennies in a factory owner's ledger. Their suffering was a silent, glowing scream, a testament to a time when industrial progress was etched into the very marrow of the poor, leaving behind a legacy of hollow faces and spectral light that no Victorian parlor lamp could ever truly sanitize. When darkness reaches its absolute zenith, it inevitably gives birth to the first sparks of rebellion. By the summer of 1888, the ghost girls of London, those marginalized specters of the industrial machine, decided that they would no longer dissolve in silence. They refused to continue paying for their existence with the literal substance of their faces. The catalyst for this monumental shift was the social reformer Annie Besant, whose blistering exposé, titled White Slavery in London, tore through the elegant veil of Victorian respectability. Her words acted like a chemical reagent, triggering a volatile reaction in the public conscience. For the first time, the comfortable middle class was forced to confront the sickening truth that the convenient matches they used to light their cigars and hearths were seasoned with the necrotic marrow of teenage girls. In an unprecedented act of defiance, 1,400 matchstick girls walked out of the Bryant and May factory, abandoning the toxic vats that were eating them alive. They marched through the cobblestone streets of the East End, many with their faces swathed in bandages to hide the ruins of their jaws, proving that even the most fragile bones could form an unbreakable wall when joined in solidarity. This strike was not merely a dispute over meager wages or unfair fines. It was a fundamental battle for biological dignity, the right to labor without being consumed by the product. Their collective courage ignited a firestorm of public outrage that eventually forced the industry to abandon lethal white phosphorus in favor of the safer, albeit more expensive, red phosphorus. The blue curse that had haunted London for decades was finally extinguished by the sheer will of those it sought to destroy. This triumph marked more than just a victory for a few thousand workers. It was the birth of the modern labor movement and a testament to the power of a unified voice against industrial greed. As we strike a match today with effortless ease, we often forget the haunting, phosphorescent luminescence that once clung to the hands of the girls who manufactured them. We must remember that the warmth and safety of our modern world were built upon the shattered skeletal remains of those who glowed in the dark. Their legacy is not found in medical jars of fossilized bone, but in every safety regulation and labor right we now take for granted. They paid the hidden cost so that we might live in a world where human sacrifice is no longer a requirement for progress. Their courage remains the final and most enduring spark in the history of human rights. Thank you for joining us on The Hidden Cost. Until next time, remember, the price of light should never be the life of the lamp-bearer. History always has a price. To explore more dark truths hidden beneath the surface, subscribe to The Hidden Cost and hit the bell. Let's uncover the shadows of history together. See you next time.